important to sort of understand the Spartan culture. So this just gives you a semblance of how brutal it was back then. At 7 years old, the state sort of commandeered your child. They would take them away from your family. They would put them into training. Because you were responsible as a soldier to be battle ready from 17 years old to 60. So imagine that. Imagine getting to like 57, 58, 59 and thinking, whew, I made it. And then a war breaks out, and at 60 years old, you got to take up arms. And they were plucked away from their families at 7 years old and put under some of the most brutal training. It was all outdoors. It was all naked. They had to hunt. They had to, kill their own food. They had to figure out which berries were poisonous, which ones weren't. They had to do hand-to-hand combat. They were an extremely, extremely battle-ready culture because it was their assumption that the men would gladly go out to defeat the opponents, but if they failed and the enemy penetrated the borders, the women then were also responsible for being trained up. It was just as incumbent upon them to protect the children as it was for the men to protect the women. So women were expected to take up arms as well. Because if they got through the border, if they got through the men, if they got through the women, those children would then be plucked away and they'd be raised in the opponent's culture to be soldiers for them. So suffice it to say, their training, their physical training, was not casual. There was nothing casual about it, right? They were there. It was life or death. If you weren't good at what you were doing, your life depended on it. I think it's great that we live in a world where we can casually go to the gym, maybe finish our sets and reps if we feel up to it, maybe not, right? But it was a completely different motivation for these people back in the day. Sorry, I missed that picture. Milo of Croton was another myth. Raise of hands. Anybody heard of Milo? Okay. The first recorded, supposedly, example of progressive training. Milo, if you don't know, was a wrestler, and a really, really good wrestler, even as a kid. But he wanted to be better, and he wanted to be stronger. So what he did, in effect, was there was a calf, and he would put the calf on his back. And he would run and train, squat, lunge, do all the things with the calf. As Milo grew, the calf grew, and by the time he was, let's say, 25, 30, he was a big, huge, bulking man. He was able to carry a full bull on his back. Right? So it really is the first recorded history of progressive training. That's what we do today. We start with small loads, commensurate with our ability to lift them, and we progress over time. And Milo suffered a tragic death. If you don't know how he died, he was literally tearing a tree trunk apart and got caught in it. And he couldn't quite get out. And then he got surrounded by wolves, and the wolves wound up eating him. So it was quite a tragic demise for somebody who was so heroic. Arete comes out of the Greek tradition. If you don't know that phrase, excellence, full potential, high standard, moral, virtue. It was understood in the Greek civilization also that your physical conditioning was an expression of your virtue. If you were fat, if you were slovenly, they looked at you as an unvirtuous person. That's how seriously they took all this. So arete is sort of like, we call it the zone, right? People in the eastern part of the world call it Zen. It was kind of just your perfection of excellence, your being in the moment, your practice, and your perfection of that practice. And that came from the god Arete. Nike. Do you guys all know this story? All right. If you don't, maybe some of you are wearing Nike now, but it comes from the Greek tradition. It means victory. It's literally the goddess of victory. And that's when they started Nike many decades ago. That's what inspired them. And that's where that little swish emblem actually comes from. Socrates tells us, it's a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of his or her body is capable. They were dialed in. They understood this. They didn't have the science, the data, the knowledge that we have, but they were doing far more right than they were doing incorrectly. And that's, as I studied this and got deeper into it, it was pretty mind-blowing to find out how much they had right. We're going to take a dip into medicine. ancient medicine. You guys ever hear the term humors? If you guys are like, anybody studying medicine may have heard it, right? Humors are just another word for fluids in the body. And the ancient world believed their model of wellness and disease was based on humorism. And we'll explain that. We'll go into detail. An excess or deficiency of humors or fluids what determines a person's health. They looked at nature, right? They made connections. You had earth, water, air, fire. And they took these elements and they noticed the nature of these elements, and they were mapping that back to the human body. Once they had those elements solidified, they equivocated a humor with it. So you have earth, which is your black bile. You had water, which is your phlegm. You had air, which is your blood. And you had fire, which was your yellow bile. So, very sophisticated way for the ancient world to be mapping these things. And then they took it one more step deeper. They took those, and then they mapped it to different temperatures. Hot, cold, wet, dry. So if you were phlegmy, if you were sort of moist and wet, they would try to use herbs, they would try to use foods that would dry you up and heat you up. If you were always running hot, they would use herb, tinctures, berries, some type of food to bring your fluids down. It was the best they had, but this is the foundation today of a lot of medicines that are still practiced. If you go to a naturopath, a homeopath, somebody who studies homeopathy, they still really believe in these principles. These principles really didn't change. So this is about 2,500 years ago. They didn't really change until the germ theory. And the germ theory was in the 1800s. So this theory, this paradigm of health had a lot of longevity. We see the same thing in China. Traditional Chinese medicine. Anybody ever get acupuncture? Yeah. They were using fire, earth, metal, water, wood. They included metal and wood as part of their elements. But in doing so, they were still looking at nature, and they were still using foods to sort of match the nature of the energy that the foods were giving off. All the way to India now. This is all the same time period, right? That's what's amazing. It's not like they were talking to each other, right? It's not like Hippocrates was getting on the phone and talking to the Yellow Emperor in China, right? These were universal themes that seemed to be happening around the world all at the same time. So in India, you have Ayurvedic. Anybody heard of Ayurvedic medicine? Yeah. Good. Then I'm your first. Vata, Pitta, Kapha. Vata equivocates to air, ether. Pitta is fire, water. And Kapha is earth. Right? So all around the world, you have these principles that seem to be universal. And then you have Hippocrates. Any of you who might go into studying medicine, become physicians, we still, 2,500 to 3,000 years later, practice the Hippocratic Oath. That's still a part of what physicians take when they finish their degree. Anybody know what the first axiom of the Hippocratic Oath is? First, do no harm. Right? First, do no harm. Work with this person. Figure out what's going on. Give them a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Do not hurt them. All right? And it's wise enough to have lasted almost 3,000 years. Hippocrates was interesting because he was really the first one. Back in the ancient world, they always blamed gods for everything, even your disease and your sickness. Hippocrates was one of the first people of the ancient world, and I'm sure there were many others, but we start with him. But he was the first one to really start taking data. You know, talking to people. How much sleep you getting? How much alcohol you drinking? Are you getting down to the ocean? How much exercise you getting? How much sex are you having? Right? He was the first one to start taking this kind of data, so he's talking to hundreds and hundreds of people, and then he has all these notes. And he's looking at people and he's saying, okay, people who do ABC seem to be running a little hot, so we need to give them coolants. People who are doing XYZ seem to run a little cool, a little phlegmy, so we need to give them a different set of herbs. And so he's looking at all these data points and trying to, further his understanding of medicine. If you guys are interested in this stuff at all, this is a great book to get your hands on. You can get a PDF online, or you can get the hard copy. The hard copy is some of these things are getting more and more challenging to get, but they're still accessible. The Hippocratic Corpus, collection of 60 medical treatises collected around the late 5th century to the early 4th century BC. You read this, it'll blow your mind, right? We're talking about humors, we're talking about all these things, but these corpuses, they go into joint manipulation, right? They go into things that you wouldn't think that they were even thinking about back then. So they were very, very advanced in terms of their understanding of medicine, and it was all trial by error, trial by fire. It was literally the Wild West of medicine back in those days. He believed movement and exercise was an efficient way of balancing the 4 humors, right? So, yeah, we can give them foods, but guess what? Movement does it too. And we know this to be true, even in modernity, right? We know that movement is good for your circulatory system. We know movement's good for your lymphatic system, right? So these connections they were making back in the ancient world were phenomenal. And he quotes, if we could give every individual the right amount of nourishment, exercise, not too little, not too much, we would have found the safest way to health, right? It's like the Goldilocks formula. But that's advice that hopefully your doctor would still be giving you today, right? It's very sound. Into the medieval era. Can you guys see that slide okay? I'll let you guys call it out. We're now in the 14 and 1500s. What kind of training are they doing? The guy on the far left, he's doing what? A one-arm shoulder press, right? I don't know what he's holding there, but that is the beginning of pressing. The people right next to them, obviously wrestling, some sort of close quarter hand-to-hand combat. You have the swordsmanship. I don't know who did the first handstand, but somewhere in history somebody did a handstand and people kept replicating it, right? He's doing a handstand on a table. It's difficult enough to do them on the ground, right? He's actually crawling up on a table and doing a handstand. This guy I find really fascinating. I pole vaulted when I was in high school. Loved it. Loved the pole vaulting, but more so loved the training. The training we'd have to do on ropes and that kind of thing. Pole vaulting originally was not about going vertical. It was about horizontal. It was about how do we get over this pond? How do we get over this, messy piece of muddy land? So it made sense that we could take a stick, a robust stick, run with it, throw it in the ground, and vault over it. And that was the beginning of pole vaulting, which eventually became, as we all know, an Olympic event. I don't know where in history it moved from horizontal to vertical, but somewhere it did, right? But you have evidences, even in the Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages were very tough, as you know. It was riddled with plague and famine and all sorts of horrible things, but exercise culture was still there. It was still a part of what they were doing. Anybody hear of Mercurialis? Hieronymus Mercurialis. Wrote a book in 1569, defined 3 types of exercises. I want you to look specifically at what it says: medicinal, postural, and breathing. Even into the 1500s, you're going to see the term medicine included into their understanding of movement and health and exercise. And that's why I'm so proud of ACM when they started their initiative, Exercise is Medicine, right? It really is living up to the grand tradition, the ancient tradition. That's when I really got on board with ACSM and really wanted to get involved, when I got the email that was an initiative. That was just very, very exciting to me, because you're going to find there's going to be other examples of this, but they use the term medicine quite frequently in their analysis when it comes to movement and exercise. We've lost this. This going into the 1700s through the 1800s was the 3 tiers for physical education. And this was taught, no matter what sport you played, it was taught in this fashion. There was martial, restorative, and pedagogical. We don't use it anymore. We don't use it in physical education. We should. It went bye-bye as the trivium and quadrivium did. If you don't know what those are, the trivium and quadrivium are the 7 principles that constitute the liberal arts that we consider liberal arts today, right? They're not teaching that. They're not teaching martial, restorative, and pedagogical anymore. So anybody going into the phys ed space, this is a great thing to look up, and this is a great thing to maybe try with, even in your own world, to bring back, because it was a really grand tradition. What did the martial do? That was your combative, right? That was the actual thing you were doing, and you were practicing arete when you were doing the martial, right? You were mindful. You were trying to execute your gymnastics. You were trying to execute your physical prowess perfectly. Restorative, bringing the body back into balance. Yoga, Indian clubs, those kind of things. Anybody familiar with Indian clubs? Anybody ever see them? Yeah. I wish I had some here as an example, but those are great. They come from India, but those are great, great methods of exercising. And then pedagogical. We all know that. That's the teaching part of it, right? So if you don't mind, I'd like to try this with you a little bit. So if I can get everybody to stand up for a second. And we're going to get martial, all right? What I want everybody to do, if you can't do this, that's absolutely fine. But what I'd like everybody to do is just sit into a squat, and we're going to hold it for 1 minute. And try not to let your butt hit the 1 minute. I got a clock right here. Okay, let's go down. Go down as far as you can. Don't cheat and hit the chair. And what I want you to think about, I'll do it with you. What I want you to think about while you're doing it, be aware. This is the martial component of it, right? Be aware of what's going on through your mind. You know, you're going to start feeling pins and needles. It's going to start feeling uncomfortable. You're going to start to have thoughts, right? Think about those thoughts. Be aware of those thoughts. Some of those thoughts might be, I hate James right now, right? And those would be justified. Just a little bit more to go. And I'll be quiet for the remainder, but just sink into it and cultivate awareness about what you're feeling. And try not to talk. 10 seconds left. And relax. Now, before you sit down, shake it out. Okay? In a very oversimplified fashion, the squat was your martial, the shaking out was your restorative, and your pedagogical was my instruction. Right? So if I'd go around to each one of you to make sure you're doing a squat perfectly, that would be a more refined pedagogical approach.